Imagine a world where being beautiful is expensive, literally. We're not talking about spending on makeup or branded clothes, but a real tax on beauty. What if the most attractive girls in school were forced to pay for their privileges? It seems unfair, doesn't it? Or maybe it's the perfect solution to balance things out. After all, why do some people seem to have everything covered, while others fight for every little achievement? That's the central dilemma in School Taxes Girls on How Pretty They Are. In this controversial video, the concept of taxing beauty comes as an unexpected twist, raising questions about inequality, privilege, and a person's true worth. What would you do if your appearance determined how much you paid for lunch? Are you ready to discover how this story can reflect on your own life experiences? If you've ever wondered what you would do if your beauty had a price, don't miss this video until the end. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell so you don't miss our next explorations of dilemmas as controversial as this one. Let's discover together the true value of what makes us unique. Click and join our community that dares to question the world around it. At the coach's shouts, the training field echoed with words that sounded more like punches. You are weak. I'm not talking about the body. It's the head. The girls looked at each other, panting, covered in sweat and doubt. Deep down, what the trainer was trying to do was clear. Break not their bodies, but their minds. The true test of overcoming was not in push-ups or running, but in mental toughness. Physical pain could be overcome. But what did you do with the fear of failure? Every drop of sweat seemed to carry a dose of personal drama, a struggle between giving in to despair or finding strength somewhere deep and hidden. And if we stop to think, how many times in life do we find ourselves in the same dilemma? It's not the weight of the world on our shoulders that brings us down, but the weakness that we sometimes let live in our heads. While one of the girls, Annie, tried to maintain her composure, exhaustion screamed through every muscle in her body. She wanted to stop. I needed it. But the coach continued tirelessly. Stop focusing on the pain. Get over it. And so, physical training turned into a true exercise in mental overcoming. The line between pain and weakness was beginning to blur. When we think we have reached our limit, we often discover that we have a little more to give. Maybe, just maybe, what limits us is not tiredness, but the fear of not being able to go further. This type of test was not just about who ran faster, but about who had the humility to admit that they could be mentally stronger. Tension among the group was growing, and some wondered if all this exhaustion was worth it. What's all this for? One of them murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. But deep down, they knew that what was at stake went beyond training. It was about facing the pressure and twists and turns of life, about finding strength when all you want to do is give up. The physical pain was just the beginning. The real challenge was learning to deal with the inner voices that tell us we're not good enough. Overcoming, at that moment, had nothing to do with bodies. It was an internal duel, whether on the court, in life, or in the small battles of everyday life. Who hasn't been through this? That inner voice that says stop, give up, you can't do it. Annie, like many of us, struggled with these thoughts, and the coach knew that. You are mentally weak, he repeated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a challenge. It was almost as if he was saying, prove me wrong. This mental drama unfolded in silence, while the legs continued to run, even though each step was torture. The coach didn't just want strong bodies. He wanted unshakable minds. When the time finally came to stop, it wasn't relief that took over. It was a feeling of internal overcoming, something that no medal could reward. Annie took a deep breath, feeling that, inside, something had changed. She was still tired. Her body still hurt. But now there was one certainty. She had defeated herself. The coach, with a discreet smile, knew that this was the first step of many. It saw, it's not the body that brings us down. It's the mind. These words echoed, and even if they didn't want to admit it, he was right. Overcoming always starts from within. However, for some, this speech sounded like a provocation. But what if my body really can't handle it? They questioned, looking for an escape. However, the coach left no room for excuses. He knew that the path to true altruism, to growth, was first through self-acceptance. It was necessary to understand that the biggest enemy was in the mind, not in the body. And often, we only realize this when we find ourselves faced with an extreme situation. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a marathon or our daily life. The battle is always internal. And for you, how many times have you stopped halfway because your mind said you couldn't do it anymore? Or because you convinced yourself that you weren't capable? In the end, the secret is not to get attached to what seems impossible at the moment. Overcoming is, above all, a personal journey, full of twists and turns. Just like Annie, we can find a strength within ourselves that we never knew existed. But to do that, you have to want it. We have to believe that we are capable of more. After all, what is at stake is not just what we achieve physically, but what we are willing to face internally. Even when others seem to be advancing, and you feel like you are falling behind, remember, true progress is not measured in speed, but in endurance. Annie, in that training, realized something fundamental. It wasn't just about the present moment, but about what that moment meant for the future. Every drop of sweat, every pain in the body, was an investment in something bigger. It was the construction of a resilient mind, capable of dealing with the ups and downs, with the twists and turns that life would inevitably bring. She began to realize that altruism, above all, was about herself. And so, the loop closes to open a new question. Is it all worth it if, in the end, only a few people seem to reap the rewards? The sun was hot as the girls trained, but this time there was something even more oppressive in the air. The budget cut had hit the team hard. No bottled water, no new uniforms, and, most of all, no relief from the unbearable heat. The coach knew this, but his approach was relentless. "This is about overcoming," he said. The words echoed with a different weight, as if the budget problem was just another obstacle to be overcome. But there was something deeper. While some suffered in silence, others found ways to escape. And that's when we start to see the drama emerge. The realization that not everyone was in the same boat. The budget cut was a harsh reality, but not everyone seemed to feel its impact the same way. In the midst of all the chaos, some girls stood out not for their resistance, but for the ease with which they escaped difficulties. "Ah, poor Rebecca. She needs some time because she's indisposed," said one of the girls with a bitter smile. And there she was, sitting in the shade, while the others ran under the scorching sun. This scene summed up the inequality that intensified with the cuts. While some were forced to face their discomfort head-on, others, apparently because of their beauty, managed to escape. As time passed, the feeling of injustice only grew. The girls looked at each other, trying to understand how some seemed untouchable by the problems that everyone must face equally. "Budget cuts for some, privileges for others," muttered one of the girls, as she wiped the sweat from her face. This feeling of inequality was not new, but budget cuts made it even more evident. It was as if beauty had become a shield, protecting some from the weight of the difficulties that fell on others. And in the background, the coach continued, "Overcoming, girls, overcoming." The conversations between the girls, now more intense, revolved around this idea. Did beauty really have the power to ward off adversity? As school budgets tightened, resources dwindled, and yet some always seemed to emerge unscathed. The cafeteria was a clear example of this. The lines grew longer, the food options dwindled, but somehow the prettier girls always walked away with an extra dessert. The contrast was evident. The others viewed the situation with disbelief, feeling that no matter how hard they fought, the cards were always stacked against them. In this constant struggle for limited resources, favoritism based on appearance began to erode the group's morale. What was once a question of lack of water or cuts in uniforms now turned into a silent battle, fought through looks and small interactions. The injustice was not just in the tight budget, but in the unequal treatment that came to light. While some faced the sun without protection, others enjoyed small privileges, almost invisible, but which made all the difference. It was as if overcoming was no longer a question of mental or physical strength, but of appearance. This growing tension began to be reflected in small things. At lunch, at training time, when choosing groups for projects, girls who did not belong to the privileged circle began to feel an even greater weight. It wasn't just the budget cut that affected them. It was the cut in the collective spirit. Why always them? They asked themselves. Inequality seemed more palpable every day, and frustration began to build like a storm about to break. The drama of the situation went beyond the physical. It was an emotional issue, of belonging, of recognition. The coach, on the other hand, remained oblivious to these more subtle issues. For him, budget cuts were just another obstacle to overcome. He believed he was teaching resilience, but what he didn't see was the corrosive effect these small injustices were having. Inequality was not something that could be overcome with willpower, and for those who did not have the privilege of beauty, the path seemed increasingly difficult. It was a hard lesson, which many were beginning to learn. Effort is not always rewarded fairly. For girls outside this circle of privilege, the only option was to continue. Keep running, keep fighting, even when it seemed like everything was against them. Life, after all, is not always fair, and learning this early can be one of the hardest lessons. But at the same time, one of the most important. The altruism that was beginning to emerge between them, the idea that they could help each other overcome these difficulties, was what kept them going. In the end, true overcoming came from unity, from the humility of recognizing that they needed each other. And so, as budget cuts continued to affect everyone, the divide between the girls became more apparent. Those who were privileged for their beauty continued to benefit, while the others had to fight tooth and nail for every small advance. Inequality was on the surface, and the environment became increasingly difficult. But deep down, they all knew that something needed to change. The question was, who would have the courage to take the initiative? Who would have the strength to challenge the status quo and show that true overcoming is not in overcoming adversity alone, but in facing together what affects us collectively? Now, questions begin to arise in girls' minds. Will this inequality continue? Will anyone do something about it? It was as if the world was divided in two. On one side, the girls who seemed to stand out for their efforts, and on the other, those who shined with a beauty that seemed to open invisible doors. The training camp, which should be a place of overcoming and equality, became the stage for a play where the privilege of beauty was the protagonist. Rebecca, the girl who always received admiring looks, was once again released from exercising, claiming she wasn't feeling well. The other girls watched in silence, feeling the weight of injustice set in. Why her? They asked themselves as they ran under the sun. The coach, without hesitation, released her with a smile, while the others remained exhausted. But it wasn't just on the field that this difference was felt. In the school corridors, in small gestures, in the way teachers treated their students, beauty seemed to open up paths that effort could never achieve. It was as if, for some, difficulties were a choice, something they could avoid with just a smile. Drama was brewing among girls who didn't share the same privilege. They watched with a mixture of envy and frustration, feeling that no matter how hard they tried, it would never be enough. The privilege of beauty, more than an advantage, began to become an emotional obstacle for those who felt on the margins. Rebecca, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to what was happening around her. For her, that differentiated treatment was something natural, something that had always been part of her life. But for the others, it was as if each time she was released from a difficult task, the weight on her own shoulders increased. The injustice was not glaring, but it was present in every small detail. Overcoming! One of them muttered between her teeth. How can we overcome something that is not given equally to everyone? The atmosphere began to fill with resentment, and what before was just a vague sensation now took shape in the words and looks exchanged. The feeling of inequality was not limited to the training field. In class, at lunch, in daily interactions, girls felt that the privilege of beauty dictated who would be treated more kindly, who would receive more attention. For those who did not fit this standard, all that was left was effort, and yet this effort often seemed in vain. It was as if beauty had the power to override all other qualities, as if no matter how smart, hard-working, or talented a girl was, she would always be one step behind the pretty ones. This perception began to erode the confidence of many of them. In the quieter moments, when the girls gathered to talk, the topic invariably came up. Do you notice how she never has to try? Of course, it's always like that. Resentment turned into a kind of bitter camaraderie. They knew that what they were facing was not just physical exhaustion or the challenges of everyday life, but a silent battle against a system that seemed to favor some over others. Overcoming! One of them laughed, without humor. How can we talk about overcoming when we don't all start from the same starting line? The turnaround, however, seemed to be in the air. Something was about to change. But as in every good story, there was a moment when perception began to change. The feeling of impotence that previously dominated them now gave way to a new idea. What if overcoming was not just about overcoming physical or emotional challenges, but about challenging the very system that created these inequalities? Maybe instead of envying, we should find a way to balance things out, said one, inspired by frustration. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there seemed to be new hope. Altruism was beginning to creep into the conversation, suggesting that instead of focusing on what they didn't have, they could start supporting each other. Change would not come easily. The girls knew that for there to be a true transformation, it would take more than simple complaints. It would take courage to face this injustice head-on. But for those who had always been in the shadow of the privilege of beauty, the path seemed clear. Either they fought for change, or they would continue to be subjugated by a system that did not recognize their true value. The inspiration for this fight came from their own experiences, from every moment they felt slighted, and from the desire to prove that there was more at stake than just appearance. And so, the first step towards change began to be taken. The realization that beauty, however powerful it was, should not define a person's value was beginning to gain strength. The drama was now not just about the inequality itself, but about the courage to question that inequality and seek a solution. For those on the margins, true overcoming would not be beating Rebecca or any other privileged girl, but beating the system that created these differences. And deep down, they knew this was a battle worth fighting. Now, it remained to be seen how they would do this. The cafeteria was the true thermometer of inequality, the place where, over time, the differences between pretty girls and others became stark. It was almost like a scene out of a teen drama movie. Some girls stood in long lines, patiently waiting for a simple snack, while the privileged ones paraded to the front of the line with innocent smiles and returned with trays full of extra desserts. It was a cruel twist, where beauty seemed to open doors to even the most trivial privileges. And the most frustrating, everyone saw this happening, but no one dared question it. The system was accepted, even if silently. As Annie waited in line, she watched Rebecca get one of the last chocolate chip cookies. What should have been a simple dietary choice now felt like an act of injustice. What else had Rebecca done besides being beautiful to deserve this? That was the question that echoed in the other girls' minds. But instead of answers, what they received was more frustration. Why can't I do it? They thought in silence, as the feeling of impotence increased. The cafeteria, with its trays and desserts, became the symbol of a system where beauty defined who was worthy of small luxuries and who needed to be content with less. For many, this injustice was hard to swallow literally, and this went beyond sweets or food. The feeling of inferiority crept into every aspect of school life. The tables where the pretty girls sat were almost sacred, untouchable. Those who were not part of this privileged group could only watch from afar, wishing not only for the chocolate chip cookie, but for the recognition it symbolized. It was a vicious cycle. The more they felt excluded, the more they yearned for a place on that invisible pedestal that beauty seemed to guarantee. And for some, the only way to deal with it was to pretend they didn't care. But deep down they mattered, and a lot. However, while some girls passively accepted this situation, others began to rebel. "It's not fair," one of them was heard muttering as she passed the privileged table. The injustice began to weigh more and more, as if every bite Rebecca took of her cookie was a constant reminder that, for some, the effort would never be enough. But how to change this? The system seemed solid, unbreakable. The girls felt trapped in a kind of game, where the rules were already decided from the beginning. And for many, it was as if the only way out was to accept the role assigned to them. Still, there was a spark of hope. Between low conversations and complicit looks, some girls began to question the true nature of this inequality. "Can't we change this?" asked one of them, as she bit into her dry sandwich. "We can't just accept things being this way forever." And it was at that moment that the idea of overcoming began to change shape. It was no longer about running faster in training or getting higher grades on tests. It was about finding a way to challenge the system itself. Overcoming, now, was a matter of refusing to accept injustice. Little by little, dissatisfaction became a driving force. The girls began to realize that while beauty could grant privileges, there was something even more powerful: unity. And in this union, there was the possibility of change. Maybe they couldn't get the extra cookie, but they could get something even greater: respect for who they were, regardless of what they looked like. This was the true silent revolution that was beginning to unfold in the shadows of the cafeteria. The inspiration came from the desire for something more, for a justice that seemed so far away, but that, at the same time, was within reach of their hands if they had enough courage to fight for it. Altruism began to emerge in small attitudes. One girl offered part of her snack to another, while they whispered about ways to change what was happening. "If we come together, we can be stronger than any privilege," one of them whispered. And so, what was once a passive acceptance of injustice began to give way to a small but growing revolt. It was as if they had finally found the strength they had been searching for, not in the privileges they never had, but in the ability to support each other. And at that moment, the coffee shop drama seemed to be just the beginning of something bigger. However, the turnaround was about to happen. Those who previously accepted the system began to wonder, is there a way to balance things? And that's how the idea of a progressive tax on beauty began to circulate among them. After all, if beauty conferred privileges, why not use it as a way to redistribute these benefits? The drama was about to reach a new level, and the girls who had previously found themselves on the sidelines now had a new mission. The cafeteria would be the battlefield where this silent war would begin. But they knew this was just the beginning. Now, the question that remained was, would they be prepared to face the consequences of this movement? The tension at school had already reached its peak when the most unexpected proposal appeared. "What if we tax pretty girls?" Annie said with a serious look as she explained her idea to the student council. The silence in the room was interrupted by nervous laughter, as if no one knew for sure whether she was joking or serious. But the truth was that she was more serious than ever. The pretty tax would be a progressive solution, based on the premise that beauty, which has always conferred privileges, could now be used to balance things out. Each girl would be classified into categories. Those at the top of the beauty pyramid would pay more, while the less attractive would be exempt. The concept seemed absurd at first, but the more Annie explained, the more the other girls began to see sense in the idea. "If beauty gives privileges, why not tax it?" she said, as heads around the table began to nod in agreement. The proposal was simple: a progressive tax that would be applied to girls considered the most beautiful, using the funds raised to cover the school's budget deficit. In addition to solving financial problems, this radical idea would also serve as a way to redistribute privileges. Justice, at least in theory, would finally be achieved. News of pretty tax spread quickly through the halls, and, as expected, generated a wave of controversy. Some girls, especially those who knew they would be most affected, were outraged. "This is ridiculous. Why should I be penalized for something I have no control over?" protested Rebecca, one of the most popular. Others, however, saw the proposal as a chance to finally level the playing field. For those who had never received the privileges that beauty offered, the tax was a form of justice. It was as if, for the first time, they could see a light at the end of the tunnel. The moral debate that followed was intense. On one side, there were those who argued that beauty was a natural gift and should not be a reason for punishment. "I didn't choose to be beautiful," said one of the affected students. On the other side were those who had suffered from years of appearance-based privileges. "And we don't choose to be ignored or treated as inferior," replied a girl, who had always felt on the fringes of attention. The school was divided into two sides, and the drama of the situation took on almost epic proportions. The pretty tax wasn't just about money. It was about equality, justice, and, most of all, about questioning the social norms that seemed to govern their lives. As the plan progressed, new layers of complexity emerged. How to define who was beautiful enough to pay the tax? Would it be fair to use appearance as a taxation criterion? These questions began to generate a kind of existential crisis in the students. Suddenly, beauty, which had always been seen as a privilege, became a responsibility, almost a burden. "Is it worth being beautiful?" a girl murmured as she looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. What was once a source of pride began to turn into constant doubt. Beauty now carried a price. Even so, Pretty Tax advanced. Annie, with her unwavering determination, knew she was about to change the dynamics of the school forever. "This isn't just about money," she repeated to herself as she prepared to formally present the proposal to the director. "It's about justice." And deep down, she knew that this twist in the story of beautiful students and those forgotten due to the privileges of appearance would not be easy to accept. However, it was a risk she was willing to take. For Annie, the idea of taxing beauty was a way of demonstrating that, at some point, privileges needed to be redistributed. The day of voting arrived, and the atmosphere at school was pure tension. The girls, divided into groups, whispered in the hallways, trying to predict what the outcome would be. Annie's proposal had awakened something within all of them. For some, Pretty Tax was an opportunity to finally receive what they felt was their right. For others, it was an affront to their freedom to be who they were, without punishment. What once seemed like a joke now became a real ideological battle. And, regardless of the outcome, everyone knew that nothing would be the same as before. As the plan progressed, however, new questions arose. How would beauty be measured? Would it be based on a vote? On subjective criteria? These questions hung in the air, generating even more uncertainty and debate. But one thing was clear. Pretty Tax was more than a simple financial solution. He questioned the very concept of privilege, power, and inequality within the school. And while the students waited for the final result, a new perception began to form. What was beauty, after all, if not another form of power, disguised as a natural quality? The question that remained now was, would they be ready to accept this new reality where beauty, previously seen as an advantage, could become a debt to be paid? As the idea of the Pretty Tax spread, discussions about its morality began to take over the school. The dilemma was clear. Would it be fair to punish someone for something that is out of their control, like their physical appearance? "It's not fair," said the girls who would be most affected by the new rule. "Why should we be penalized for something we didn't choose?" And the question hung in the air, gaining more and more strength. On the other hand, there were those who argued that this was the perfect opportunity to balance things out, to finally bring justice to those who, for years, had been left out of a system that favored beauty. The school was divided, and conversations about justice and equality dominated every corner. For many, the Pretty Tax wasn't just about money, but about morality, about what was right and wrong. If beauty gives us privileges that we don't deserve, then is it fair that we pay for it? Asked one of the affected students. And this doubt echoed among everyone. How far does the responsibility go for something we receive without asking? The drama of the situation was not just in the words, but in the expressions filled with uncertainty and anguish. The idea of progressive taxation based on appearance was a twist that called deep-rooted values into question. While some girls tried to justify the tax as a form of redistribution of privileges, others found themselves caught in a moral trap. "Punishing beauty is not the solution to inequality," said one of the students who opposed the tax. "This will only create more division." And, in fact, the school began to fragment. Beauty, which had always been seen as an advantage, now became a burden, something that could be a reason for punishment. It was as if the very concept of value was being questioned. The inspiration that previously came from appearance was now transformed into a reflection on what really matters in life. As the days went by, the moral dilemma began to touch on something deeper. The students began to realize that although beauty was a visible advantage, everyone had some kind of privilege in life. For some, it was intelligence, for others, sporting ability, and for still others, the support of a united family. The constant comparison between what we had and what we lacked began to erode the spirit of unity that previously existed at the school. "Why are we comparing ourselves all the time?" one of the girls mused aloud. This was a question that everyone began to ask, even without knowing the answer. And so, The perception of what was really worth it began to change. Beauty, previously seen as a powerful currency, now seemed less important compared to the other privileges each woman had. The constant comparison was meaningless because each had their own struggles and advantages. The real overcoming, they realized, was not in being prettier, smarter, or more popular, but in accepting who they really were. This revelation brought a sense of humility, something that had previously been absent from the discussions. The real battle was not against others, but against one's own tendency to compare oneself and feel inferior or superior. This new understanding, however, did not come without challenges. The habit of comparing oneself, of seeking to validate one's own value through others, was something deeply rooted. But how can we stop comparing ourselves? One of the students asked. And that was a question that everyone needed to face. Perhaps the solution was something simpler than they imagined. Focusing on themselves, on their own talents and virtues, without trying to measure everything in relation to others. For some, this was the real moral dilemma they needed to resolve, the need for internal acceptance rather than seeking external recognition. As this realization gained traction, some girls began to feel that the pretty tax, while well-intentioned, might not be the ideal solution. Perhaps, instead of punishing those who had privileges, the focus should be on how everyone could recognize and value their own qualities. The inspiration came from the idea that, instead of trying to forcefully balance the scales, each person should learn to accept the advantages and disadvantages that life gave them. Altruism, in this case, was not about taxing the beautiful ones, but about helping everyone see the value they carried within themselves. The moral dilemma, therefore, was not just about social justice, but about a more personal question. How do we accept who we are in a world that seems to place so much value on what we cannot control? The answer wasn't simple, and each girl would need to figure it out for herself. But the path seemed to be clearer. Constantly comparing yourself to others would not bring happiness, only more frustration. And to overcome this, it was necessary to focus on what was special about each one, what made it unique and valuable. In the end, true privilege was the ability to see your own worth, regardless of what the world around you said. Now, with this new view of what really mattered, it remained to be seen how the girls would deal with the tax itself. As the pretty tax debate continued, something deeper began to emerge between the girls. Amid the heated discussions about beauty, privileges, and justice, a new perception began to take shape, that the value of each of them was not in their appearance, but in the internal qualities that often went unnoticed. Maybe true overcoming lies in stopping comparing yourself to others, Annie said out loud, reflecting on what she had learned in the process. It was a simple but powerful thought. Beauty, with all its social impact, now seemed small compared to the greatness of a confident mind and a kind heart. Rebecca, one of the girls most affected by pretty tax, also began to reflect on her own position. She was always seen as the prettiest, the one who received all the privileges. But this brought more difficulties than she expected. People only see my appearance, but they never ask who I really am, she confessed to a friend. It was at that moment that Rebecca began to see that her real struggle was not against the tax or against the other girls, but against the idea that her value was limited to what others saw on the outside. The revelation brought a sense of liberation, an awakening to something she had always had but never recognized, her inner worth. As the girls reflected on these questions, deeper conversations began to emerge. What really matters to you? One of them asked during the break. The question, which might have seemed superficial before, now carried greater weight. Each of them had something they valued, something that defined them beyond beauty or privilege. For some, it was intelligence; for others, the ability to connect with people; and for many, it was the humility and altruism they demonstrated on a daily basis. The comparison process, which had previously caused so much pain, now began to lose its power. True personal growth was in accepting who they were, rather than trying to be what others expected. This new understanding brought not only peace, but also an inspiration for change. If we stop comparing ourselves to others, we can support each other more, one of the girls said during a class. And indeed, altruism began to spread. What were once looks of envy and resentment now turned into gestures of support and understanding. The girls, who previously felt inferior or superior to each other, began to realize that they each had their own struggles and challenges, and in the process, they became more united, more willing to help each other grow. The school, which previously seemed divided between the beautiful and the ordinary, was now beginning to transform into an environment of acceptance and mutual support. The real turning point wasn't in the tax or the fairness discussions, but in the way the girls began to see themselves and each other. "I don't need to be the prettiest to have value," one of them declared during a debate. And that phrase, simple as it was, captured the spirit of transformation that was taking over the school. The real privilege, they discovered, was being able to live according to their own values, without relying on external validation. From that moment on, overcoming gained a new meaning. It was no longer about overcoming physical adversities or the challenges imposed by society, but about winning the internal battle against constant comparison. The girls learned that, to truly grow, they needed to accept who they were, with all their imperfections and qualities. The drama of comparison that once defined their lives began to fade as they focused on developing their unique abilities and valuing what really mattered. That was the real inspiration they were looking for. The impact of this new perspective began to be reflected in their attitudes. Tax discussions lost steam, and what had once seemed a matter of life and death was now seen in a different light. "Maybe taxes won't solve our problems, but our attitude can," Annie said, summing up the general feeling. True personal growth, they realized, came not from trying to level the playing field by forcing superficial equality, but from accepting differences and using that as a source of learning and growth. Altruism and humility, which once seemed distant concepts, were now part of their daily lives. However, the journey of internal acceptance was not yet complete. The habit of comparing yourself to others is hard to break, and even with this new realization, some girls still struggle to completely break free. But instead of wallowing in this struggle, they began to support each other more, share their insecurities, and find comfort in the idea that no one is perfect. Growth, they realized, was a continuous process, and with that, the drama of comparison began to transform into a story of self-discovery and acceptance. Now that you've reflected on all these concepts, the question is, what are you going to do with this new understanding? Will you continue to accept life's inequalities without question? Or are you ready to change the way you see things? The video shows us that the real battle is not just against external circumstances, but against how we see ourselves and how we compare ourselves to others. What have you done to value your own qualities? Have you ever thought about stopping worrying so much about what others think and focusing on what really matters to you? Maybe it's time to act. What do you think? Are you ready to transform your mindset and start valuing yourself for who you really are, instead of being stuck by other people's standards? If you want to continue learning about topics that make you rethink your life and grow as a person, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss the chance to participate in conversations that can change the way you see the world.